Okay, here we're going to do 1856, and I just want to put a warning. If you haven't read some of my comments, or if you haven't watched some of my videos complaining about YouTube or whatever, I can't support YouTube anymore. I'm going to keep putting my videos up there, but I can't comment on it. They're stupid. Trying to shove G+ up my ass is not working. Anyway, so if you want to make comments that I can ever see, because they no longer get delivered to my email, or that I'll respond to, or that other people can converse with, I'd suggest Board Game Geek or 2d6.org. I can't find an easier solution than YouTube to just throw content on, but I can no longer pay attention to it. I try to answer what I can in comments and such not. I just cannot anymore. I'm not going to buy their crap. I'm not going to take G+ up the ass in response to having a YouTube account. Okay, so 1856. And maybe they'll fix it, but I wouldn't count on it. They keep trying to shove it at me. This time it just doesn't fix. So I like a lot of the 18XX games. Possibly my favorite series of games that's out there. I'm trying to think, there's things like CWB and NBS that I really, really love on the war game side of things. Outside of war games, this may be the series that I like most inside, including war games as well. And this particular game of it may be my favorite of the XX series. That's a little tricky. I've played a lot more 1830, and I've seen some games recently. First of all, there's all the deep thought ones that, who knows, I've been on waiting lists for like 4 years for one of them, and it just, nothing's come. No comments, nothing. Maybe I'm frozen at like 100 and something on the list. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if maybe they change sites and I'm essentially frozen there and we'll never get the games. It's not like I had to pay yet or anything. They're like P500s. So there might be some that really, really excite me there. There's also 1830, which I've played so damn many times that I feel more comfortable with it. The few times that I've played this, I'd say I've played this maybe a dozen times, which is a lot for me. And when I say so many 1830, I'm probably talking 30 to 40 games of it at most. And then there's one newer one for me, for everyone, which is 1861 down there, which I've only played once solitaire, and it really intrigues me. And then sort of close to an 18XX that I'm very interested in. So let's count all the winsome games in the pile. This still kind of is beating them all out, except with one possible exception. Baltimore and Ohio really interests me. It's sort of a stripped down XX, but okay. It has a lot of things in common with XX and a lot of things in common with the winsome games. And it just, it's kind of like the Age of Steam mixed with an XX better situation. It does intrigue me. So, but this one may well be my favorite of those that I've gotten to play a significant amount of times. And the reason for that is it kind of does this mixture of the core 1830 principles. And yes, I know 1830 is not the first of the games, but to me there's this whole branch off with the 1830 designs that really excites me. This, the two-dimensional stock track, and this dickiness with the shares where companies are moving around and you can't really be an investor alone in the game. As opposed to things like 1835 or 29, where there's not really this opportunity to dump companies and rape them, this, that, and the other. 1856 may be a little bit more intense in this than 1830. It certainly gives you more tools to play with, but not so many as to overburden the game, and it remains a fairly short playing game. So 1870, which I like some of the ideas of, 2038, which I like some of the ideas of, they have a couple of issues that I don't like about them. One of which is that they run too long. They also have some aspects with the trains coming out, or spaceships, that don't please me. But this one. All right. Core rules are the same as 1830. I am going to go a little bit into that, but not too deeply, because you can look at the 1830 video that I did, or other people have done stuff to get an idea of the base 18XX. There's a short game for 1856 and for 1870. These aren't cool like the short game of 1830 was. They don't just make a shorter 18XX game. They make a track building game. It's really a learning game. It's like playing Civilization's learning game. The traders and farmers and fishermen and butchers or whatever. None of those are any interesting game. They don't share enough of the flavor. 1830 short game is quite good, and I would strongly recommend that as a great starting point for the XX series. It may not be in the new version. Some people seem to not know. Okay. So the core idea of an 18XX game, let's hit that first, because I probably haven't explained them enough in the others. The core idea is you're going to be buying stock certificates with your personal cash. Once you sell enough certificates to start a corporation, the corporation is going to have one of these charts here. Trains go here. If it buys any of these trains, money goes in the treasury. Let's ignore this for a while. That's special for here. And then you'll be trying to make money, presumably, through your runs on the board and through your appreciation of the stock value. And anybody who's invested in you goes along for the ride. So you're kind of hoping you don't, each have an equal amount of that corporation. Now, I've seen arguments that in the Winsome games, sometimes it's okay to that it is essentially okay to cut a deal with someone in the game by sharing a corporation with them and working together to build it. There's no working together in this, though. In this, the only working together is the cash sitting on the corporation, and that cash is vulnerable in a way that it's not vulnerable in most of the Winsome games. So then, after you hand out the stocks, essentially, and that's done through a purchasing. At the beginning of the game, you get to set the prices on your stock market based on these par value situations. And then as the game progresses, the prices change. Now, the prices for the stocks in here stay at the par value. Anything in here is available at the open market value, as is anything in your certificate holdings. The corporations will run in stock valuation, which means the highest priced corporation goes first, and then from there, the furthest over to the right, if they happen to be tied, will go before it. And what they're allowed to do is a number of things in general, one of which is to lay a track. And basically, you're allowed to lay yellow tracks at the beginning of the game. These upgrade to greens later, and then browns, and finally to grays. Now, you have to maintain the track that's already on the board. So, for example, if I've got some track like this, if you upgrade a piece, it has to include this. There are other factors to that too. You're only allowed to build track on the board based on where your corporation connects to. So, for example, let's look at the Great Western coming out of here. It would be able to lay track coming out of here, but it wouldn't be able to lay track, say, coming out of here. You're also not allowed to lay track that goes off the board, etc. And for a detailed explanation of almost all of the rules of this game, they're over on my 1830 video. Or someone else's. All right. After you lay the track, you're going to presumably connect certain locations. I'm going to need... let's get this. I wasn't sure how I was going to explain this at all. That's not going to work. Let's put this one. Okay, so for example, here, the Great Western, we'll put a dot here, will connect these two locations. I can run trains, if I have them, with a number equal to the number of locations I'm connecting. And you know what? I don't remember. I believe in this game, that I just read the rules, but yeah. Okay. So the value that your train produces is going to be equal to adding up all the cities that you hit. And some of the cities will be kind of smaller cities, what I call boinker doinkers. This one I can't play because it would run off the board. I probably can't play this one either. I'm looking for, there's like one piece I can play there. There it is. So it would take a 3-point train to run between these three. Locations with a dot in them, if it's not your dot, they block other people from traversing them. Now, it's possible later in the game for locations to have multiple dots, and unless both of them are filled, you can traverse through them and collect the income from the city. You can also collect the income from the city by ending on that dot. So for example, if we had the CA here, and this is legitimate, that can be connected later perhaps, and then I need a doinker. So the CA could run a train between here and here, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, but it would take a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 train, which you can see is quite far up the train value chart, right? All right. Your train routes must all connect back to one of your station tokens, and they can't run over the same track in a single run. A single train can't run through the same city in the same run. And there's all kinds of rules like that. They all pretty much hold true in the 1830 and in many of the derived games. But there are some little twists in some of the games. This one tends to be without most of the twists. It does have some differences in track lay, though, which I'll get to in a moment. Remember when I said you can upgrade different track to different colors? Well, one thing that's available is at late stages in the game in this one, you're allowed to actually eliminate doinkers. So for example, I could replace this with this, and I think this comes after the 5s or 6s are bought. We'll get to that when we look at the different stages of the game. And now I no longer have to hit a city there, so now I can get through with a smaller train. Another option is that it can actually upgrade from one of these to one of these. And now I'm going through the same city, but I'm also going through its more value, and it's got a possibility for a dot. And that's kind of an interesting little twist on the standard XX design that 1830 exemplifies. There's a few games that have this kind of upgradability, and we'll see how the tiles work there. After you calculate out what your income is, you have two choices in all the XX games pretty much. You can either pay it out or you can swallow it. If you swallow it, all the money goes in your treasury, and your stock value goes one space to the left, which, as you can see, is going to lower the value of it. If you pay it out, the money gets distributed appropriately by share. So each player's 10% share is worth 10% of the amount of money that's been collected to be paid out. Now, the question that comes in some of these is, well, what happens with shares that are here and shares that are here? 1830 says shares in here, the money goes back to the bank. Oh, and money is beautiful in these guys. These are the Mayfair ones. They did a really good job on the money. A later game used the same money design, but with like a slick surface, and it's just hideous and smaller bills. And it's kind of like, okay, don't put paper money in if it's going to be pure garbage. I mean, if you don't expect people to ever use it, don't put it in, but this stuff is good. Okay, So the question here is, what happens if you do pay out? And I have to find that. Dividends, okay, so this works with the 1830 model, which is dividends and shares in the open market go into the company treasury as if the company owns them. That's a little weird. We can discuss what's going on with there. Essentially what it means, I think, is that this is really hard to justify, but I think what it means is shares in here are reflecting a bank loan, essentially. That's not really cash, but additional share capacity that's just not held by the corporation. It's not really the corporation's issued so many shares and is holding some of them and is getting some of that percentage back. But then what about these that are held by random people? Why is that not going into the void? Well, we don't have a good answer for that. But in terms of play mechanisms, it's kind of a neat one, because if you can keep your shares floating around in the open market, you get lots of cash into your treasury every time you pay out, and the people who own the shares get money as well. That's sort of an optimal situation. Okay. After you make your payout in an 18xx game, you're allowed then to buy trains. And essentially you're allowed to buy only, usually, the best train, the weakest train on this chart. You're also allowed to buy trains from the open market if they happen to be there. We'll see how that happens. Or from another corporation if the 3 trains are out already. That depends on the phase. And that's really to prevent the game from just going completely unhinged in the first turn, because people could do some really ugly stuff to corporations if you don't restrict that. There's some other. Also, anytime during your train operation, you're allowed to buy these. Now these are, I haven't explained. At the beginning of the game, these are going to be set up and bid upon by the different players. And this follows the same exact rules as 1830 in this game, which is that you set them up in order, essentially of price. They have special rules to go with them, which we'll talk about in a moment. And in the first stock round of the game, players are allowed to either buy the first one offered or put a bid on one of these others. And the game doesn't start until these are all sold out, and then they can start buying the other certificates. These are going to pay an inherent income at the beginning of each operating round, i.e. just before the trains run, all these run and they produce their cash. They hand it to the player. If the player owns it, they hand it to the corporation if the corporation owns it. This is all standard XX from the 30 idea. Okay. Actually buying the trains. So if you're buying from here, your corporation has to come up with the amount of cash in there. If you do not own a train on your corporation and your corporation connects 2 cities, you must have a train on it. You must pick one up. And there are certain restrictions to that, which are essentially to say, hey, if you don't have the cash in here, you can reach into your own personal pocket as the president of the corporation. The president is an important concept in these games. It's the guy with the most certificates, basically, or the most shares of a company. He gets to make all the decisions for that company within some boundaries. However, if you don't have a train, you're obligated to buy one under those circumstances, and you must kind of buy the cheapest thing available either here or here if you're pulling into your pocket. You are allowed to buy your choice of trains if you have enough cash in the treasury, and that includes trains from other companies. An interesting fill-up in this game is that actually money passed between corporations in purchasing a train is hidden. The only restriction is it has to be at least $1. That's very much like 30 there. These private companies you can buy from a player, for anywhere from half to twice the price of the private company. That's a very powerful tool because you're able to get money from your corporation treasury into your pocket. There's often this kind of conflicting feeling here. Do you want the money in your corporation? Do you want it in your pocket? Well, the money in your pocket is how you win the game. So usually you want it in your pocket. And this is usually a way of raping a corporation. A corporation can usually be machinated in such a way that you can keep it running even after you've done it a lot of harm. Sometimes, though, you've damaged it so much that it's a tremendous burden, i.e. it has no trains, it's not hooked up well, or it's hooked up to the degree where you have to buy a train and you have a very expensive one. And in that case, well, the person who owns that corporation, the president of that corporation, is going to be responsible maybe for a really big and expensive train. All right. And yes, I'm kind of trying to do this half explaining the rules and half not. Because it is really close to the 1830 rules, but I want to give the differences and I want to give enough of the core rules to be able to, and I'm probably mucking it all up in a horribly ugly way. Okay. So after you've bought your trains or whatever, then it passes to the next player's operating round. And there'll be a certain number of operating rounds between stock rounds. At the beginning of the game, it's only one. But as later and later trains come out, the 3 train brings it to 2 operating rounds between. The 5 train brings it to 3 operating rounds between, if I recall correctly. I think it's straight 1830 there. One thing I didn't mention is the effect on stock prices. I think if you pay out with the corporation, the price goes forward to the right one, and it'll go up by these arrows. If you don't pay out, or you have zero base income, the price goes back. The prices also change when you buy and sell stocks to some extent. If you sell any stocks, every 10% share, and this game has 5% shares, will drop by one column, by one row, sorry. So if this was sitting here and I sold 3 shares, I would drop down 3 spaces after I collected my income at the higher value. So I've just undercut everybody else's shares that way. And that can be a very powerful tool too. Okay. Where the hell are we? I think we're at where things... let's talk about the yellow and brown region. The yellow region... So in the game, you're going to have a limit to how many certificates you can hold total. That includes certificates that have multiple shares. Now that limit is changeable in this game. And 61 had that as well. If your stock is in the yellow, if the stock price is in this yellow area here, it doesn't count against that certificate limit. If the stock price is in the brown area, it doesn't count against that certificate limit, and there's another additional advantage, which is you're allowed to hold as much of that corporation as you like. Normally, you're limited to 60% of a company, just like in 30. Now, there is one interesting thing. The Mayfair games had this closed. If your stock value goes there, the company disappears. It's over. All its tokens go away. The track remains on the board. No corporation owns track, but its trains get flushed into the market, and its stock value has just become nothing. It's closed as a corporation. It no longer exists. That's a bad thing to have happen. So you kind of have to, if you get down into the brown area, which is very valuable in 1830, you have to be real careful not to fall into the closed area or where somebody might dump your stocks into there. You don't want to be sitting here. You want to make sure you pay out and get this moved out of there. And that can be kind of tricky to do. All right. Let us look at what's special in this game. First of all, there's the private companies. And when you look at the 18AL and 18GA, they have little special rules for their private companies. So, in a sense, that's sometimes the big, oh, that's what changes it all from an 1830 game. Most of the deep thought games, my understanding is, add more. And the Mayfair games add more. In this particular case, what do we have? Floss Tramway doesn't do anything special. It just costs money and pays out money. The Waterloo and Saugeen, or sausage, that controls this hex. And this is kind of like the D&H over in 1830. What it allows you to do is once a corporation owns it, the corporation can play one of these tiles in it as its tile lay for the turn. You're allowed one tile track lay for turn. And it can drop a dot in it as its dot lay, and that's actually free. But doing either or both of these closes the private company, so it'll no longer be in the corporation's hands, which means it's no longer going to produce that $10 to a round. The other thing is, these private companies, when they control a hex, like this one controls this hex, no one can build there unless a corporation owns that hex. If a corporation owns it, someone else can slip in and build there and screw with you so you don't get your advantages. The Canada Company, this allows, I believe, an extra track lay in this space. Doesn't count against your normal track lay. Great Lakes Shipping. That is going to come with this Port plus 20 marker. That marker can go on any space on Lake Erie or Georgian Bay that's a settlement, basically anywhere with an anchor. And what it's going to do is, for the one corporation that owns it, it's going to add 20 to any runs that go through that city. I believe this closes it, but I'm not sure. Yep, it closes it, so you're not going to get your $15 a turn off of that. Now that $15 a turn just goes into your treasury. That's not money you can pay out. So there's kind of a difference. Even if you're only running one train, if that money is part of your run, if the port marker is part of your run, you'll get 20 extra bucks towards your run as opposed to 15 extra bucks in your company treasury. Why is that different? Well, because the 20 bucks per run can end up being paid out to people. The 15 bucks for your company just goes into the company treasury, and even if you're paying out all your money to other players from the corporation's runs, the corporation will still be getting an influx of cash. So there's also kind of this little subtlety there that you have to think about. Niagara Falls Suspension and St. Clair Frontier Tunnel. They control Buffalo and Sardia. And what they do is, when a corporation buys this, and this is your big hitter in this game, it's only $100 private company, so the most you can sell it for is $200 to your corporation. The corporation gets either a bridge or a tunnel marker, and that means all of its runs to Buffalo or Sardia will be $10 higher. It hits those cities at $10 better. That's kind of nice. But there's an additional point to it. Any corporation can pay the corporation that owns the bridge or tunnel $50 for the right for a tunnel or bridge marker. That usually doesn't happen. Once the private companies are all closed, which is when the 5 train comes out, corporations lose all the advantages they may have had, except the bridge and tunnel stay on any corporations that have them. What doesn't stay is this, and corporations can buy tokens from the bank for this for $50 from the bank. Alright, here's our list of certificate limits per player. We're going to play a 6-player game, which means at the beginning of the game, you're allowed 11 certificates. This chart looks very much like the 1830 chart. But after, I think, the 5 or 6 train comes out, yeah, after the 6th train comes out, you reassess the certificate limits based on the total number of corporations that are still in the game, not necessarily in anybody's hands. So initially you have a lot of corporations in this game, right? 8, 11, 12 total corporations. Well, but this one, the Canadian National Railroad or Government Railway, can only exist by replacing one of those. So the most corporations you can have left in the game, and they can be destroyed through 2 means. One is by falling off the map here. That's very seldom to happen. And the other is by falling into the Canadian Government Railways, which often happens to at least a couple companies. I've seen some games where they don't happen at all, though. In either of those cases, the total number of corporations available might drop. And you can see these numbers go up. So, 15 instead of 11 for that end phase of the game, which gives you, even if you're doing very well and you've filled out your stock portfolio, you're going to have new room in that case. Of course, on the other hand, if somehow all the corporations are crashed, well, you've got to kind of make up for that and get rid of shares and certificates because your certificate limits have gotten lower. And you know what I don't think I said? I know I mentioned you're allowed to, yeah, I did say you're only allowed 60% of any given corporation if it's not in the brown. All right. One thing I didn't mention, though, is at the end of any stock round, if players hold all the shares of a corporation, the value of the corporation is going to go up 1 box upward. And if you're at the top, well, I think you're stuck, but it might do a 1830 does one of those. Let's see. Yeah, I think it gets stuck up there. It doesn't have that. So if you're sitting here and you're sold out, you don't slide here. Maybe it's 70 that does that. I don't know. You just end up banging up against the top. All right. So the phases of the game, probably have to go through those a little bit because there are some factors in there that are different. In phase 1, the 2 trains available. Basically, the phase is going to be 1 less than the train. Yellow track can be played. Each corporation can hold 4 trains. They're not allowed to purchase the privates yet. There's 1 operating round between each stock round. These, they change value. So this, for example, is $30 until segment 5, and then it goes up to 40. And here it's segment 5 and the diesel. There's different prices. And you use the first certificate limit table. When we hit phase 2, you're going to be able to do upgrades to green track. And in some cases, like these places with yellow around them, or these, green track is the first track played on them. Costs money to enter some territories. So for example, this has a $40. You have to pay that out of your corporate treasury to lay track there. That's not a phase-based thing. I'm just trying to reach for the rules at random. Public companies are now able to purchase the privates. There'll be 2 operating rounds between each stock round, or each pair of stock rounds. And then phase 3 is when the 4 train comes out. Yellow and green tracks are allowed to be played. You're only allowed to run 3 trains on a public corporation. There's 2 operating rounds still. All the Type 2 trains are scrapped. They're now obsolete. So they get destroyed when the first 4 train gets bought. And that's something you're going to see. As trains come out, older trains disappear from the game. And therefore, people might be without trains on a corporation. In phase 4, when we get the first 5 train, this is the key point to the 1830 game. And in this game, it also is a key point. The 5 train is your first permanent train in both sets. All right. That means if you can't get a 5 train or better, if you don't have that big 550 sitting around, you better be thinking pretty hard how you're going to finance the existence of your corporation without hurting yourself tremendously. And that might be handing it to someone else. Okay. That adds brown upgrades to the green track. And there are a number of different things. We'll set those all up later. That adds, corporations can only hold 2 trains maximum. All the privates are closed immediately. There'll be 3 operating rounds between stock rounds. We're going to be using any values with 5 on them from here. We'll go up one more after this. And then we go to the first 6 train being purchased. And they're starting to get pretty pricey, aren't they? At this point, one of the interesting factors of the game comes into play. See these government loans? I didn't explain these yet because they're special to 1856. They're going to have to be cashed in at this point and all repaid. I'll get to them in a moment, but this can be a massive, massive hit on you. If you have the cash to pay them back, this can result in bankruptcy. If you don't have the cash on board the corporation, the Canadian Government Railway gets your corporation. Basically, you go into receivership and get moved under the government aegis. This is going to add the final track type. There's gray track tiles. These are only going to be certain key cities that get upgraded really big. There's a couple of cities for this. Toronto, Barrie, and Hamilton, I believe, all get upgraded to grays. Maybe not Barrie. I don't remember if Barrie or London upgrades to a gray. Yeah, just Toronto and Hamilton. Sorry about that. And you can see Hamilton doesn't get quite as big as Toronto does. Alright. Great. Put these over. Manual dexterity, one-handed, not good. Alright. At this point, the Great Lakes Shipping Company token comes off the map. It'll no longer provide any advantages to anyone. All the 3 trains are scrapped. And now we're going to use, we see how many corporations are left, and now that's the new certificate limit. And if somehow somebody is over their certificate limit at this point, they don't have to rectify that until their stock round, but they have to do it as soon as possible in the stock round. A few things I didn't explain in the stock round. I'd be much better off just working through the rules probably. But when you sell a certificate in one turn or in one of your actions in a stock round, you're not allowed to then buy that certificate back. Essentially, you're going to be selling as many certificates as you like in any given action and buying up to 1. There's another restriction, and the order doesn't have to be that way, but it generally is. Because there is one more restriction. You can't buy a certificate and sell it immediately. You have to wait till your next time around, give people a chance to dump that. All right, the final is that we go to the first diesel. Now that's not a diesel. These are the diesels. I'm going to play with these optional 8s. It doesn't make a lot of difference. These are a little cheaper, so they're less harmful to purchase, but they're also a diesel gets to go through infinite cities as long as it doesn't go over the same track more than once, and nor can it hit the same city twice. An 8 is just an 8. Okay, so one thing that changed back when the 6 is bought is that small cities, these boinker doinkers, can be upgraded and downgraded. You can make them disappear. Once you get to 6, that's still the case, which is the 8 train. Public companies are only allowed 2 trains at this point. This is the truth over here too, but the CGR, Canadian Government Railroads, allowed a 3rd train. The 8 kills the 4 trains. Starting with the 6, we have 3 operating, or no, starting with the 5, we have 3 operating rounds. And then with the diesel, you can see we hit another price change on there. Those are not always positive. So for example, here it starts out low, goes up, and then goes back down. Just as a heads up. All right. And we got to jump around. Unfortunately, the rules are fine if you know an XX, but I'm having trouble. All right, let's jump over here for purchasing trains, because if diesels are available, okay, when are diesels available? That's my question. So in 18XX, as soon as the first 6 train is bought, the diesels are available to be purchased. I don't know if that's the case here. And that's what I'm trying to find. It's not listed here. Yeah, diesels are available. Okay. So yeah. So as soon as the first 6 is bought, normally you have to buy all the trains in a pile before you can buy from the next pile. But in this case, as soon as somebody buys a 6, the diesel or 8 train becomes available for purchase. And there's a special rule here, which is you pay $1,000 for these unless you do a trade-in. And you can trade in any of these, including the bonus 4 train. But you got to be careful, because if you're planning on trading in a 4 train, you got to make sure you get the first diesel, because if you don't get the first one, your 4 train will be gone as soon as somebody buys that first one, and you won't have a trade-in. And you get the trade-in value here. Now, in the case of a 5 or 6 trade-in, you're giving up a permanent train in order to get a better permanent train at a discount. And not much of a discount equal to what the 4 train cost you. In the case of the 4 train, well, it's just pure win to convert that into the 8 or the diesel. And the diesel works the same way. It's just $100 more on both prices. All right. So, let's talk a little about loans, because they are the cool thing in this game. This game contains 2 things that work together very closely that are very, very fundamental to it. One is the loans, the other is the CGR, and they are interconnected and linked, intrinsically linked. That's what I was looking for. All right. During your turn, during your operating round with a corporation, you're allowed to grab 1 loan. And you just pop it out and put it over on your corporation. And you get $100 if you take out a loan, as long as you take it out before you have to pay interest on your loans. In general, that means that $100 can help you lay track or buy a token. After you make your run, you have to pay interest of $10 on every loan. If you take out a loan after the interest paying period, you only get $90 for the loan. Basically, you're taking it out at the beginning of the turn, but it's not apparent. Right? You're just making the decision later. Okay. You are allowed to have as many loans as there are shares of your corporation in players' hands. Which means if you have the presidency and that's it, say everything else is out here in the market or in here, you can only have 2 loans out. If you find yourself in a position where you have more loans than you're allowed to have, you must immediately pay those loans off. Wow. Immediately is a little extreme. You must do it, I believe, during your first operating or stock round in that condition. If you sell stocks and you screw your loan situation with that, you have to pay it off at that point. You may have to sell more stocks because of that. So, You have this right to pull additional money. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about is corporations don't float the way they do in 1830. The way they float in this game is when you have as many shares as the next available train. So at the beginning of the game, all that's available are 2 trains. If you buy the president's certificate, your corporation has started. Not only do you get to set its par value, and does money go into the treasury? We'll go into money in the treasury because that's another change. But if, when it's its turn to operate, it's still sitting there with as many shares, at least, as there are, as the number of the next available train, it gets to start running. That means that you don't know for sure during the stock round whether or not you're going to successfully start a corporation in some cases. So for example, if everybody in a 5-player or 4-player game starts a train with 2 shares, well, let's say each one buys 2 trains. First, second, third. The 4th guy is now sitting on 2 shares of a corporation that he can't actually run because there's only a 3 train available. So he can't actually even start that corporation. It doesn't start having to pay any penalty for not paying out dividends. It's just not operating yet. It's dormant until somebody buys another certificate. You can actually get caught in a really loop in this game where you don't have a starting corporation and nobody's buying your shares, and you don't have the cash for them, and you're not making any cash because you're just sitting on crap at that point. That's a problem. Try to make sure that doesn't happen. All right, let's see what else we have. You're only allowed 1 loan per operating round, which means if you're trying to build up to a more expensive train, sometimes you have to take out loans over a period of time. And there's a cost to taking out loans. You're paying $10 a turn on each of those loans you have out of your treasury. You may have to take out a loan to pay off your loan interest. This is a bad situation to get into usually, but maybe not terrible. And let's explain why. Well, before we do that, like all 18xx games, it can end in 2 ways. One is that the bank goes bankrupt. If the bank no longer has enough money to pay everybody, you start writing overdrafts just to make sure that everybody gets their cash for it. And the game will end. Let's make sure we have the timing because some of these change when they end. After the complete set of operating rounds. If the bank runs out of money after a stock round, you play out that stock round and the complete set of operating rounds, which probably is going to be 3 operating rounds if the bank's running out. The other way the game can end is if a player goes bankrupt. A player goes bankrupt if he has some obligation, like buying a train or paying off loans because he doesn't have he doesn't have shares out to cover the loans that are there. That player counts up his assets essentially. Now, if he can sell certificates, and that if you can sell certificates is an issue. You cannot sell certificates you can't sell the presidency of a corporation unless it can go to, if it's the company that's causing you to go bankrupt. That's one issue. You can't sell so that there's more than 50% of the company in the open market. That's probably the only restrictions that have an effect here. Obviously, if you sell so that you don't have your loans covered, you're causing additional problems there, perhaps for yourself. Perhaps for someone else if you're selling the presidency. All right. It is unlikely that early loan issue is going to cause people to go bankrupt. But I think I've seen it happen. We had one guy in our group who was usually a pretty good XX player, but he always crashed in 56. One of two ways. He either crashed on those initial loans, or I think more often he crashed after the CGR is formed and he paid off all his loans and had no money left for the later trains. Anyway, it is quite possible to be in a position where you're not allowed to sell certificates, but you still owe money. And at that point, you've gone bankrupt. And then everybody, including the person who went bankrupt, adds up their value. The person who went bankrupt it loses an amount of value equal to what he couldn't pay off. But he's still in the running for winning the game. Very unlikely. I haven't figured out a way to engineer that yet. Clearclaw assures me that it's possible in 30. I haven't managed it. All right, and then the winner is the person with the most value. If share values are assessed before the CGR is formed, before all the loans go away, essentially, the share value for corporations, in terms of determining their valuation at the end of the game, is going to be reduced by 10 for each outstanding loan. Now, so your total income is going to be the value of all the certificates you hold, valued on here, perhaps with loans in play, and any cash on hand that you happen to have at that point. All right, let's go to the CGR, because that's one of the more interesting things here. And I think I'm just doing a terrible job with this one, but okay. When the first 6 train comes out, it's time that all the loans are due. If you got loans on your company and you got cash to cover them all in your company treasury, you must pay them all off. That money just gets sucked out of your treasury. You must, and the loans go away. And your corporation's fine, right? Except it's, down $600 or something. That can be very dangerous. You have the option to reach into your pockets and pay off loans for corporations you own. If the Treasury can't match it, you can reach into your pocket and pay a little extra. Dangerous, dangerous thing to do. I mean, that cuts into your victory conditions, but maybe keeping your corporation out is good. Of course, that's a corporation with no money on it now, so it had better have a permanent train or one in sight somehow, say on another company you have. All right, let's say you miss. Let's say you still got loans on there and you don't want to pay them off out of your pocket, and you're not forced to. Then what you're going to get is, for every 2 shares of a corporation that doesn't have its loans paid off, players are going to get shares of the CGR. And this kind of reminds you of the Prussian over in 1835 in terms of its potential power and also the color of its tokens. But it has a lot of tokens. It can absorb a lot of the earlier corporations. Depending on how people play, it could absorb most of them. Although usually I only see a couple corporations go into it. It is possible that so many go in that these certificates, the 10 shares, will not cover. That means that they're 2 for 1, and odd shares, I think, just get burned, right? Once all players have exchanged all their shares in the open market are then exchanged in pairs. At 2 for 1 after that, all shares in absorbed companies including any single share left in the open market, are removed from play. So if you're not able to have pairs of certificates of shares in your company, you will get shafted a CGR certificate. The CGR, you're going to get half as many shares as you had in whatever companies went into the thing. It is possible that if you had more than 20, more than 2 companies, right? Yeah. Well, if there are more than 20 shares outstanding, well, then you end up issuing a second set of CGR stock, and all the CGR shares are only worth 5% instead of 10%. And that's going to reflect in the calculation. Instead of getting a tenth of the value of the run, you get 5% of the value of the run. And then basically the holdings on the board are absorbed into the CGR, and it has its own more powerful corporate stance with lots and lots of tokens. It's got some special rules which we'll get into, but it can have bridges, tunnels, this, that, and the other all on board it. It's also allowed to have an extra train over other people. So in these stages, it's allowed to have 3 trains instead of the 2 that other people have. It doesn't exist before that. It's more of a fixed event than the formation of the Prussian in 1935. The first person who ends up with 2 CGR shares is going to get the presidency, and then it moves to whoever gets more as you go down the line. Now, the share absorption is done starting with the president of the person who bought the first 6 train. So when you buy that first 6 train, you trigger this, and you will get the first shot at shares of it. Its tokens replace the tokens of corporations it's on. It can't have 2 tokens in one city, though, so they'll collapse into one. Its treasury and trains, or whatever's on board those other companies, it may have to discard some trains. It also gets cash. We haven't gone into how these. We haven't gone into how corporations and their treasuries work. That's a very complex mechanism in this game compared to most of them. Most of them, you either. 2038 is painful too. 1830. You pay the cash for the corporation you want. Once you hit the floating limit, which is a fixed number in 1830, 60% of the company, you end up getting all the cash that corporation would ever form. That doesn't happen here. Here, the way it happens is a little different. At the beginning of the game, you get whatever cash is put in to buy shares. Up to 5 shares. Each corporation has a destination. If you're able to make a run from the starting city of that corporation to the destination of that corporation with one of your trains, ignoring, you don't actually make the run physically, but ignoring any opposing corporation's tokens in the way, you've hooked things up. And that means you'll get the cash for corporations, for shares that are sold above the first 5 as they're sold. You still have to sell your shares out. That's at the beginning of the game. If the first 5 trains been bought, but the first 6 train has not, you will just get cash for each share all the way up to 10. Again, very much like this situation, you don't have to worry about this destination, but you do have to sell out your shares. Once the first 6 train is sold, now it takes 6 shares to start a company, same as in 1830. At this point, if you start at that point, you will get your entire prospective income not income, but floating value, which is to say all 10 shares worth come to you as soon as you get the 6 shares sold. Very complex way of handling it. But let's jump back to the CGR, just to do things completely randomly. Okay. The actual running of the CGR is a little weird here. The CGR is not allowed to buy a non-permanent train. It's only allowed to sell trains at their face value. Permanent or not. Until it has a permanent train, it is not allowed to pay out dividends. The president gets to decide whether it pays out dividends once it has a train. Its starting stock value will either be $100 or the average of all the share values of the absorbed companies, whichever one's higher. And they give you rules on how to do that. It doesn't matter whether those were 5 or 10%, because the stuff that's fallen into them has turned into the equivalent value, is the idea here. If you end up going into the second issues, these guys only count as half a certificate for all your certificate limits. You're still allowed to hold 60% of the company, and they also count as half of towards your normal certificate limits. And that includes the presidency counts as a half certificate there. Interesting. I didn't realize that. You figure out your new certificate limit based on that period. That's what you do. So, the CGR can never be closed. It will not make it into the closed space. I seem to remember it was able to swallow Yeah, I don't see that. I thought I was able to swallow without going back before it gets a permanent train. Two alternates to this game are available. One is, hey, let's switch up all those destination locations. I've actually never played that. I don't see much point to it. I like the 8 train versus the diesels. I don't think it makes a whole hell of a lot of difference. This is not a game where there tends to be, like sometimes in 1830, long routes that you can really take advantage of a diesel in any way. The reduced price makes it a little bit easier, but the real reason I do it is they say, hey, it's more historical. The time period of the game, diesels didn't really exist. I always feel kind of funny about diesels anyway. Even if they are diesels, they're able to basically do some really crazy stuff that always kind of weirds me out. So I'm not a fan of diesels in games, even though they're in 1830, and I love 1830. I usually don't play with them in here. All right, well, I bumbled through this somehow. And I think we'll get more interest out of the playthrough than the actual rules introduction. I just was not really in the mood to give the rules, I guess.